It's a bit of a personal reflection, and there is a lot of I language in here, and I just invite you to see if there's any part of it which resonates with you, and to hold it as we join together in reflecting on God's word to us this morning. Growing up, I had this nervousness or fear around people who I deemed as being different from me. It could have been because they were in a position of authority, like a police officer, a head teacher, or later in life, even my boss. Or it could have been because they were dressed differently. They spoke differently, looked different in some way, maybe because of their race or the religion, or even their sexual identity. It's a feeling of unease. I'm not sure how to act, what to say, and so I try to avoid them. I'm ashamed to say this feeling, this response hasn't disappeared over time, and it could now be described as appearing standoffish, rude, sometimes even classed as a sign of white middle-class privilege, which makes me feel even more ashamed to say, but it's true. This is a challenge which I need to conquer. It's got nothing to do with the other person. This is my discomfort. I need to become aware and manage my feelings and responses. It's something which I can reduce by educating myself, talking to people, because at the root of this is a feeling of fear and anxiety. There's a flight or fight response, a fear of the unknown, a fear of the difference. More than anything though, I need to keep this in check, to not let this feeling of fear, uncertainty, wariness to govern how I interact and speak to other people. Because if I don't, these feelings will take over and open the way for prejudice to influence my actions, which for me is counter-gospel. It pulls apart the kingdom rather than builds it up. When prejudice influences our actions, we start to see people as unworthy or less than our own selves. And yet our Bible tells us at the very beginning that we are all made in the image of God. The whole of humanity was made in the image of God, which for me means there is something of God looking back at me in the face of each person that I see. What then does it mean when my prejudices against another human being say about God? I'm challenged today by our gospel reading, to be honest. I'm often challenged by the Gospel of Matthew because the writer seems very much open and shut in the language that they use. They were writing specifically to a Jewish audience with the intention of convincing them that Jesus was indeed the Messiah. If we'd started reading at the beginning of chapter 10, we would have heard Jesus' instructions to the disciple according to the Gospel of Matthew as, "Do not go amongst the Gentiles or enter any town of Samaria. Go rather to the lost sheep of Israel." Our passage is in that context. It continues on as part of Jesus' instructions to the disciples before he sends them out. The Gospel of Matthew was written to convert those who believed themselves to be the chosen nation, Israel. And much of the writing reflects that in how it echoes the Hebrew scriptures and its rhetoric. I've also been struck over the last few weeks of the reports of Black Lives Matter protests, which have been happening in America, here in the UK, and elsewhere in the world. And the conversations that have then followed about how we have memorialised and celebrated our history. I've been struck by the measured responses of some who've clearly educated themselves versus the knee-jerk reaction of others who have counter-protested from what seems to be a place of fear and a sense of threat, even a false sense of pride. Are not 2 sparrows sold for a penny? Yet not one of them will fall to the ground unseen by God. and even the hair on your head are counted. So do not be afraid. You are more valuable than many sparrows. These were Jesus' words of reassurance to the disciples. You are owned and known to God, who sees everything, who knows when a sparrow falls. These small birds, which were priceless birds, anybody could afford them. If that is true of the sparrows and me, then it must also be true of everyone else. It's true of those people whom I feel uncomfortable around because there's something different about them. The people who I try to avoid because I don't know how to act, what to do or what to say when I encounter them. They also are owned and known to God. Our reading from the Gospel of Matthew can feel very much black and white, us versus them, and yet the whole Gospel, the good news in its entirety, is technicolor in its second glances, second chances. God's love transcends our earthly barriers which seek to segregate the worthy from the not, the right and proper from the down and out, white supremacy from the black minority, far right from the liberal left. Those barriers which calculate worth based on the colour of our skin, the money in our bank, the clothes that we wear, the streets that we live on, the accents that we speak, or the places of birth, above and beyond the image of God reflected back in the face of the person in front of us. Surely that's all that matters to us. The face which has been handcrafted and shaped by the same God who has given us life. There's an overriding message in this short passage which speaks of the importance of the place from where we start. This passage was part of Jesus equipping his disciples to go into the surrounding towns and villages to heal the sick and to drive out demons in order to gather in God's people. Jesus wanted to make it clear to the disciples who they were to engage with, and that's according to Matthew, and where their loyalty lay. First and foremost, they were God's, and to God they will return. Yes, the message that they were to bring would cause friction and tension with people they would meet, even at home with their own families, but they were God's, owned by and instruments of. We are each called to take that claim for our own. In our baptisms, we are named by God. So if we then take that same claim, owned and instruments of, that also means the people who look back at me, at each one of us, are also God's. And they have the potential to be instruments too. And it's that which governs my interactions with other people. It's that which I must remember when my fear and prejudices creep in. If everyone is owned by God, who am I to put them down? To think that I'm better than them, or to judge the way that they live their life before I've listened to their story and acknowledged God in the face staring back at me? Jesus was preparing his disciples to go into the world to proclaim the good news and to be builders of God's kingdom. The baton has been passed on to us, and like the disciples here in Matthew's Gospel, we are called to the whole world, to all people. But are we ready to manage our own prejudices and to live out the life we're called to build God's kingdom here? Amen. We're going to sing, if you feel able to. If not, just listen and to read the words on your screen. It's when we're living, we are in the Lord. There is a line that's repeated at the end of each verse, and it's we belong to God. We belong to God. So let's join together.